So, I know what you're all thinking right now. Don't even tell me, because I already know it's, man, my default browser is so boring and I'm in desperate need of a replacement. Well, newsflash, I have just the thing for you because Opera GX is the sponsor of today's video. The world's premier gaming-oriented web browser. When using it, users are able to pick between a plethora of different appearance options like the colors and the light and dark theming that other websites and browsers have. But where things get interesting is the mods list, where you get those features I just said, but can also customize your browser's default background to have different settings and images on them that even animate. With mods, you can get optional features like background music, keyboard sounds, and opening and closing tab sounds. Disabling and enabling mods and their effects is in a menu accessible from the sidebar as well, with a full list of mods in the GX store. Using the GX Corner feature, you can stay up to date in the latest game deals and game releases and game news even. Using my link, you'll even be able to see my latest 12 uploads in your GX Corner too. Normal default browsers use up PC resources like the suck cannon from Ratchet & Clank, but with the GX Control, you can monitor and limit how much of your CPU or RAM the browser can use. No longer will an abundance of tabs guzzle up the precious RAM on your PC. It's also incredibly easy to switch browsers, as Opera lets you import your settings from other browsers like your browsing history, bookmarks, and all that, even allowing you to use all the Chrome extensions you may have. If all that sounds exciting to you, which it no doubt does because I read your mind earlier, you're going to want to head over to my link, operagx.gg/jsreviews, and get started on your new setup. You'll thank us later. Once again, special thanks to Opera GX for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get into the show. Divisive discourse is nothing new for video games. However, if there was one debate that has raged on in gaming for a long time, it would be, where is the line between a remake and a remaster? Alongside all the other words included in that discussion like reimagining or port or re-release. What makes this debate so compelling for so many is that on its face it seems quite simple, but the deeper you look at it, the harder it is to define. In movies, things are simpler, I'd say. You have original works, and if that movie's put on a 4K disc years later, you know it's the same movie just with better picture quality and hopefully no other bizarre changes. What a remake for movies is can get complicated because sometimes you have reboots trying to do the same story as an older movie, and on other times it's a completely different thing, or in other cases, sequels will just double as a remake. Or maybe it'll still be a sequel but not really reference older stuff as much. But still, I think movies are a more streamlined discussion than video games are when the terms re-release, remake, remaster, reimagining, and reboot all do mean different things in games but are used somewhat interchangeably. Take Crash Bandicoot for example. The Insane Trilogy collection is one of the games quickly pointed to as an example of a remake, but I just find it funny that when it was announced, Sean Layden was on stage and called it a remaster.
The original Crash, Crash 2, and Crash Warped, fully remastered from the ground up for PlayStation 4.
No hate on him, of course, I'm just using that as an example of how there is this industry-wide effect of these words not having strict boundaries between one another, and are thus used like they all mean the same thing. To showcase how there are no agreed-upon standards for what these terms mean, I decided to give my Patreon audience a poll to answer a few questions. I included the link in the description for anyone who wants to join the discussion. I'll post the results in the community tab in a week or so. But as for what the Patreon audience did say, I had it set up to where first you had to define what a remake, remaster, and reimagining were, and then had to look at a bunch of popular examples and say which category each game, like Metroid Zero Mission or RE2 Remake, fell into. And unsurprisingly, when it came down to a game-by-game analysis, only one, Ratchet & Clank 2016, had a unanimous answer when the rest were very split or just had some variance. So first things first, I'm going to try and give some definitions of these terms and then talk about what makes it complex and then end with how I prefer to look at it. So let's begin. What is a remaster? Well, respondents pretty commonly stated that a remaster is an improved release of a game that already exists, usually built off the back of the game that was originally released. There are many obvious cases of this. God of War 3 Remastered for PlayStation 4 takes the game that was originally on PlayStation 3 and increases the resolution and produces a more stable frame rate. Similarly, The Last of Us Remastered on PS4 is the exact same game from PS3, only it includes the DLC, made the frame rate 60 FPS, and increased the resolution. When taking 6th generation titles from their original consoles to new ones, you'd put the game in widescreen if they weren't already and bump the frame rate and resolution. These tend to be core pillars of a remaster, and like I said, I think many are in agreement on that. However, remasters have a lot of edge cases. Something like Sonic Adventure 2 Battle was released after the game's original version and included new content and updated character models. This definitely doesn't meet the criteria for a remake, but it could be considered a remaster of the original SA2. If someone wanted to make that case, I feel like you could. even with it being a release technically within the same generation as the original. A real edge case on remasters and remakes would be what the Zelda series has done. In my poll, I included Ocarina and Majora 3D, as well as Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword HD, and Link's Awakening from 2019. For Link's Awakening, it was almost unanimously agreed on as a remake, which I'd agree with. But for Ocarina and Majora, it was split between a remake and a remaster, while the other three were considered remasters by the majority. What I find interesting about the split is that all these Zelda ports are basically the same, taking the original game and building on top of it with improvements. The 3DS ones are popularly considered remakes, but the Wii U and Switch ports are not as much, when I'd say they'd all meet the criteria for a remaster, although Majora's Mask makes enough changes to where you could consider it a remake, but Ocarina of Time definitely doesn't. When something like Super Mario 64 DS rebuilt the original game for the new console and the new engine, so calling that a remake by definition is more fitting. Rebuilding an old game from scratch with the intention of it largely being the same core experience tend to be how people defined what a remake was, and there are many examples you can point to. The Crash N.Sane and Spyro Reignited trilogies did that, replicating the core mechanics and level progression of each game with some quality of life features. Although there is variance even when looking at that standard. Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes is a remake of the first game, and it does rebuild the entire map of Shadow Moses Island like Crash or Spyro, but then it includes new mechanics the original didn't have, and also changed things like backtracking to tighten up the pacing. The new MGS3 remake seems like it's going to be doing something similar to that. But back when MGS1 had done it, it got a mixed reaction from fans. But my point is that this is a rebuild of the first MGS that is very faithful in story and level design, but also does more to expand the gameplay than something like Crash. But both are remakes, you know? The Last of Us Part 1 for PlayStation 5 being called a remake caused controversy since on its face it's the same game, right? But when you look at it, I think it's pretty much the same thing as Crash or Spyro, just for a game that is a lot more recent than those PlayStation 1 games. It expands on the AI of the enemies and the partners, includes new game modes and customizable features, and rebuilds the visuals and locations from scratch, overhauling the facial animation entirely. This satisfies the necessary conditions for a remake when looking at how people define the word. I have never had an issue using that word to describe this game because it clearly is doing something that The Last of Us Remastered was not doing, as that game was the exact same experience from PlayStation 3. And if we're going to have to choose hard lines between remake and remaster, I would say Last of Us Part 1 falls in the remake end. I believe all the examples I've just given are remakes, as I'll get into later. Remakes can also have edge cases like remasters do. I included the VR version of Resident Evil 4 on the Oculus Quest 2 on my poll to see what people would say about it, and this was actually the most divided option of all, as some votes went to port and others went to reimagining and others to remake. I think it's a remake as it is RE4 but rebuilt for VR. A remake is a new version that rebuilds something old, right? If that's the simple definition to work with, then this is a remake by default. The 2002 version of Resident Evil 1 on GameCube is, in my opinion, an edge case. It's the most faithful RE remake of the bunch, but also completely changes the art direction from the original, outright replacing old content with new, adds things that were never there, and takes the goofy-ass original version of the story and takes it more seriously. My point is, this is quite different from something like Crash or even Metal Gear because it's going far beyond the original, while also getting the same label as games that just do something old with newer graphics and some new features. Metroid Zero Mission is very similar in that iconic elements of Metroid 1 are all there and accounted for, but it's so expanded that it's basically a new game. So are these remakes closer to reimaginings? Metroid Samus Returns is one more people call a reimagining since it's very different from Metroid 2 right from the offset with new abilities and levels and all that. But I've never played this one fully. I got my fix from the fan remake of Metroid 2, AM2R, in 2016 and never really felt grabbed by the official remake. But I'm using it to make my case that even in something that sets out to be a remake, you might end up with a product that is very different from the original. A few times now I have brought up the word reimagining, which is certainly the least self-explanatory of the bunch, but you do hear the word a lot when some of the more recent remakes are brought up. The most consistent description from the Patreon audience would be a new game that is merely based on an old one. A remake tries to bring back an old game faithfully in its entirety, but a reimagining is a new game with old concepts or story beats. Some popular examples include Star Fox 64 being a retelling of the first Star Fox game, and then Star Fox Zero being a new take on Star Fox 64. That's a weird IP, but that's a story for another day. Resident Evil 2, 3, and 4 are all examples of reimaginings in that each one is based on the original incarnation but is not remotely shackled to the original work as they change story details or level design or just remove things that were there before. Once more, this sounds like a simple and consistent definition to work with, but the issue is that the approach many games labeled as reimaginings take are completely different from other games that are also called that. For example, Ratchet & Clank 2016, the game that got 100% of the votes for reimagining, is a game that takes level design recycled from the 2002 Ratchet & Clank almost exactly, but it being based on the film means it's a completely different storyline from the original game and also features entirely different weapons and gameplay mechanics. By contrast, RE3 from 2020 uses no level design from the original, cuts several locations and puzzles from the OG game, and puts less interesting ones in their place. It is RE3 in that it's still Jill and Carlos versus the Nemesis in an escape from a doomed Raccoon City, but that's pretty much it. Both are reimaginings, but are completely different from each other. Hell, RE2 had people split between remake and reimagining, as it is still clearly RE2, as it features all the major plot beats of the original and its core locations, the RPD, the sewers, and the lab, but they're all created from scratch, which leaves some stuff from the original out of it. RE4 then came out, and this one did rebuild the whole game, often with rooms done exactly as they were before with some major expansions or remixes. The new RE4 is a lot closer in approach to RE1 than 2 or especially 3, but overall, none of these are the same as each other in their approach despite being given a similar label. Then something like Final Fantasy VII Remake is also put in this camp despite, from what I gather, being a game that is more of a sequel that relies on knowledge of previous events. I am refraining from talking about it too much because at this moment in time I haven't played it, so I'd hate to speak with authority on things I know nothing about, because that's a massive pet peeve of mine whenever I see it. But I hope you see what I mean here. These are all different categories of remaking a game, but when trying to nail down which is which and what the line between them is, you realize there isn't one. There's way too much variance here to even possibly consider placing all of these into set categories that can't change. I think game remakes are more like the color wheel than a crayon box, you know? You can't definitively say when green ends and blue begins because it's pretty subjective, and I think this is similar. So I say we shouldn't even look at it like there are or need to be definitive lines in the sand. Instead, looking at this as a sliding scale from least remade to most remade. Here's how I look at it. On the furthest end of the least remade category, you have emulation and ports. Emulation, like the Mega Man X Legacy Collection, is replicating a game that existed on another console. The game is running through software that replicates the Super Nintendo, for example, warts and all, such as slowdown. Emulation is a complex subject as it does take care and attention to do right, and that is a thing companies have screwed up many times with issues like graphical bugs and integer scaling not being given proper attention, but that's also an issue for another day or just some other channel to discuss. Ports are the same game, just on a different console. Batman Arkham City on Xbox 360 is the exact same game on PlayStation 3, released on the same day. It's not supposed to be different. In the tier above that, you have what I'm calling enhanced ports. These are meant to be the same game, but with enough new features to be considered different, like a Game of the Year edition or whatever. The original Mega Man X collection on PlayStation 2 was not emulating the first 6 X games, they were ported to the PS2, running natively on the console, which allowed for improvements like no slowdown. This is also the camp I place games like RE Code Veronica X or Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 on GameCube. It's the same console generation, and so it's still the same game at its core, but has touch-ups like character models or new content or new cutscenes or whatever. Code Veronica X is not a remaster of the original game, as it's not some big leap in visuals or frame rate, but it's also got changes from the original that make me place it in this category. The next tier above is Remasters, which is the same game, hopefully, with some improvements to the visuals and frame rate. Think of the Uncharted games on PlayStation 4 and PS5, or the Metal Gear Solid HD collection. All these games are how you remember them, but with smoother presentation. Above that, you have what I call shot-for-shot remakes, which are games that rebuild an experience exactly as is, with all the same hurdles the original might have had, perhaps with a quality of life improvement here or there, but it's not trying to rock the boat. Think of Crash or The Last of Us Part 1. Then the next tier up is what I call an overhaul. These are games verifiably based on the original, but also feel free in doing new things like Resident Evil or Metroid Zero Mission. From what I can tell, this seems to be the most popular option of remaking games, since people want to experience the same thing but done differently and significantly better. That's an opinionated statement, I know, but I'm just speaking best case scenario here. But there is backing for what I'm saying, since these two are usually held as the gold standard of game remakes. Then at the furthest end, the most remade games are ones that are different from the original and just use the original as a starting point, and its DNA being present in the final game is there in varying degrees. Reboots tend to be lumped into the remake discourse, and if I counted them, things like DMC Devil May Cry or Tomb Raider 2013 would be the furthest end of the spectrum, because these are games that often have nothing to do with the original. For that reason, I don't count them, but you can. This sliding scale allows for that variance I talked about and helps the discussion of different remakes, since what category it falls into is less of an issue, since I don't think there needs to be strict definitions. With this, for example, I'd say it's fair to call The Last of Us Part 1 a very souped-up remaster, closer to a shot-for-shot remake on this scale than the Jak and Daxter HD collection, but still resting somewhere between that and, say, the Twin Snakes, which itself rests somewhere between what Crash and Spyro tried doing and what RE and Metroid had done. This way, RE 2 through 4 and Ratchet can all be called reimaginings, but their differences are explained away by saying it's a sliding scale relative to how everyone feels about these terms, rather than objective fact. The reason I made this video is because I realized I've gone on the whole what even is a video game remake speech like a half a dozen times on the channel, and I figured it would be for the best to make a video that stated how I saw it that I can refer back to in later videos over explaining it again and again. Similar to how I point people to my video on what games deserve remakes, as that's also a divisive bit of discourse. Remakes are an interesting thing, and I find talking about them to be compelling, as it's just fun to compare and contrast things I like with newer iterations. The culture of nostalgia is something I've critiqued before, but as I have said, I don't dislike nostalgia and remakes at all. A video like this goes to show I'm pretty fond of them, and I think it's a very nuanced thing to talk about. But that's pretty much it from me today. So I'll wrap this video up by saying that pretty soon we'll be doing a very heavily requested retrospective, so stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, I'll say what I always do. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.